Welcome, my dear listener. Tonight, I shall tell you of an age when the world was young and the stars were closer to men's hearts. I have walked through many centuries, watched empires rise from dust and crumble back into it, seen the turning of countless seasons. But there are memories that remain particularly vivid, carved deep into the fabric of time itself. Tonight, I wish to share with you one such memory, a time when death walked openly among the living, when hunger became a companion more faithful than any friend, and when survival was not a certainty but a daily miracle. Come, settle yourself by the fire. Let the flames cast their gentle light as I recall for you the age when pestilence and famine tested the very limits of human endurance. This is not a tale of kings or conquests, but of ordinary souls who faced extraordinary darkness and somehow, against all reason, found the strength to continue. The wind tonight reminds me of those days, cold, persistent, carrying whispers of things unseen. Let us begin. I recall a time before the Great Dying, when the medieval world hummed with a quiet kind of prosperity. It was not wealth as you might imagine it, no golden streets or laden tables for the common folk, but there was a rhythm to life, a predictable turning of seasons that people had come to trust. The 13th century had been kind, relatively speaking. Populations had grown steadily for generations. Villages expanded into the surrounding forests, clearing land that had stood wild since time beyond memory. New fields appeared where once only bracken and oak had flourished. Children were numerous, families large, and though hunger visited often enough, famine seemed a distant specter, something grandmothers spoke of in warnings, but rarely witnessed. I walked among them in those years, disguised as a traveling scholar, perhaps, or a wandering storyteller. I watched them plant their crops with calloused hands, saw them gather for saints' days and harvest festivals, heard their laughter echoing across the commons as children chased one another through the evening light. They did not know, how could they, that the world they trusted was fragile as morning frost. The land itself seemed tired. Centuries of cultivation had leached the soil of its strength. Fields that once yielded abundantly now produced thinner stalks, smaller grains. But people are adaptable creatures. They simply worked harder, cleared more land, planted more seed. The forest retreated before the plow, and no one paused to wonder if perhaps they had pushed too far. Then came the spring of 1315. I remember the rain, not the gentle showers that coax life from the earth, but a relentless, violent downpour that began in the warming days of March and simply refused to cease. Day after day, week after week, the heavens opened with a fury that seemed almost personal. The sky hung low and gray, a suffocating blanket that turned the world beneath it into a sodden nightmare. The fields became lakes. Seed rotted in the ground before it could sprout. What little did emerge grew pale and weak, stalks bending under the weight of water they could not shed. The hay could not be dried. The straw could not be cured. Livestock stood in mud that rose to their bellies, shivering in the cold that should have given way to summer warmth, but never did. I stood at the edge of a village. Its name has been forgotten by all but me now, and watched a farmer stare at his ruined field. His face held no expression. He had moved beyond despair into a kind of hollow acceptance. Behind him, his children waited by the door of their cottage, silent as stones. The rain continued through the summer, through the autumn, through the winter, and into the next spring. 2 years, 3. The temperatures dropped. Unseasonable cold settling over the land like a curse. This was no ordinary weather pattern. The climate itself had shifted, entering what scholars would later call the Little Ice Age, though no one living then possessed such grand names for their suffering. The Great Famine had begun. It crept slowly at first, like water seeping under a door. Grain stores from previous years provided some buffer. People tightened their belts, watered their porridge, stretched what they had. But as the failed harvests mounted, as the stores emptied, and nothing came to replace them, the true horror began to reveal itself. By the second year, people were eating their seed grain, the precious stores meant for planting. It was an act of quiet desperation, trading tomorrow's hope for today's survival. They knew what it meant. Without seed, there could be no crop the following year. But an empty belly cares nothing for future harvests. The livestock went next, not slaughtered for meat, not at first, but simply dying. The wet conditions made it impossible to cure hay. Without fodder, the animals starved. Cows and sheep died in their hundreds. Their bodies left where they fell because no one had the strength to move them. The price of salt, needed to preserve what meat could be salvaged, quadrupled. For the poor, it might as well have been gold. I watched families make impossible choices. Which animal to slaughter first? Which child to feed when there was not enough for all? These were not decisions made in council or debate. They were made in silence, in the dark hours before dawn, with trembling hands and breaking hearts. The pigs survived better than most. Clever creatures, adaptable, willing to eat what others would not. In some villages, they became more valuable than gold, for a breeding sow meant the possibility of future meat, future survival. But for every pig that lived, a dozen other animals perished. And still the rain fell. The roads became impassable rivers of mud. Trade slowed, then stopped entirely. Villages that had relied on traveling merchants for salt, for tools, for news of the wider world, found themselves utterly isolated. The world shrank to the distance one could walk through knee-deep muck, which was not far at all. I remember the silence. In normal times, the countryside hummed with life, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the chatter of workers in the fields, the songs of women at their washing. But as the famine deepened, the sounds faded. Animals had no voice left to give. People conserved their strength, speaking only when necessary. Even the birds seemed fewer, their songs subdued. The church bells still rang, marking the hours, calling the faithful to prayer. But attendance swelled, not from devotion, but from desperation. What else could they do? They prayed for sun, for warmth, for the rains to cease. They prayed for mercy they could not see coming. Some believed it was punishment, divine retribution for sins they could only guess at. The priests encouraged this thinking. It gave meaning to the meaningless, order to chaos. If this was punishment, then perhaps atonement could end it. And so they prayed harder, gave what little they had to the church, flagellated themselves in public displays of penance. The rain did not care. It continued to fall. By the third year, the word famine was no longer whispered, but spoken openly. There was no point in pretending anymore. The granaries were empty, the fields were barren, the animals were gone. What remained was the terrible arithmetic of survival. Too many mouths, too little food, and no relief in sight. I have lived through many ages of darkness, seen empires collapse and civilizations crumble. But there is something uniquely terrible about famine. War is brutal but swift. Plague is horrifying, but indiscriminate. Famine is slow, methodical, intimate. It does not strike you down in a moment, but hollows you out day by day, meal by meal, until you are a ghost wearing your own skin. And this was only the beginning. The Great Famine would rage for 7 years in total, though the worst of it lasted from 1315 to 1317. When it finally released its grip, Europe had lost millions, exact numbers lost to time, but estimates suggest 1 in 10 perished, perhaps more, in the hardest-hit regions. But even as the famine slowly receded, even as the rains finally ceased, and the sun returned to coax life from the exhausted earth, the world had changed. The old confidence was broken. People had learned that the ground beneath their feet was not as solid as they had believed, that the systems they relied upon could fail completely. They did not know it yet, but this was merely the prelude. The great dying had tested them, yes, but the true horror was still to come. In 3 decades' time, another visitor would arrive, one that would make even the Great Famine seem merciful by comparison. Death itself was coming, and its name was plague. I remember the year 1347 with a clarity that still, after all these centuries, makes me pause. There are moments in history when you can feel the world tilting, when the very air seems to hold its breath. That year was such a time. The rumors came first, as they always do. Whispers carried along trade routes, stories told by merchants who had traveled from distant lands. They spoke of a great dying in the east, of cities emptied in weeks, of bodies stacked like cordwood in the streets of distant Cathay. The tales seemed impossible, exaggerated in the way of travelers' stories. Surely nothing could kill so many so quickly. I knew better. I had seen plague before, in other ages, other lands. I recognized the signs. The disease traveled along the Silk Roads, following the ancient paths of commerce. It moved with the caravans, nested in the bales of silk and bags of spices, carried in the fur of rats and the bodies of fleas, no larger than poppy seeds. It crossed mountains and deserts, patient as stone, inevitable as winter. By 1347, it had reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, where Genoese merchants maintained a trading post. The Mongol army, besieging the city, found their ranks decimated by a mysterious illness. In a final act of biological warfare, though they knew not what they did, they catapulted the diseased corpses over the city walls. Whether this actually spread the disease, or whether it would have entered anyway, matters little. The plague was inside. The merchants fled, taking ship for home, carrying with them more than silk and silver. They carried death itself. I followed one such ship, invisible as I often make myself. I watched the first sailor fall ill 3 days out from port. By the time they reached Sicily, half the crew was dead. Those who could still stand stumbled onto the docks of Messina, fevered and delirious, their bodies already showing the telltale signs, the swollen buboes in groin and armpit, dark as bruised plums. The harbor masters took one look and tried to turn them away, but it was too late. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. Within months, it spread through Italy like wildfire, through dry grass, then France, then Spain. By 1348, it had crossed the Alps and was ravaging the German lands. By 1349, it reached England, carried on merchant ships to the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. I walked the streets of London in the summer of 1349, the city that had bustled with life. that had rung with the cries of merchants and the laughter of children had become a place of surreal horror. The smell hit you first, the sickly, sweet stench of decay mixed with the smoke of countless fires lit to purify the air. Bodies lay in the streets, sometimes for days, because there were not enough living to bury the dead. The plague manifested in 3 forms, each more terrible than the last. The most common was the bubonic plague, named for the buboes, the grotesque swellings of the lymph nodes that appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. They grew to the size of apples, hard and hot to the touch, oozing blood and pus. The pain was said to be excruciating, like burning coals pressed against the skin. Fever followed, intense and unrelenting. Victims shivered violently, even as their skin burned. They vomited, sometimes blood. Their bodies ached as if every bone was breaking. Dark spots appeared on the skin, petechia, the sign of blood vessels bursting. In some cases, the fingers and toes turned black, the flesh literally dying while the victim yet lived. If the buboes burst on their own, there was a chance, small but real, of survival. Some recovered, their bodies somehow fighting off the infection. But for most, death came within 5 to 7 days of the first symptoms. Then there was the pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs. This form was even more deadly, spreading directly from person to person through coughing and sneezing. Victims literally drowned in their own fluids, coughing up bloody sputum as their lungs filled and failed. The mortality rate was nearly absolute, 95% or higher. Death came swiftly, often within 2 days of the first cough. The most terrifying form was septicemic plague, when the infection entered the bloodstream directly. This killed so rapidly that victims sometimes collapsed and died within hours. Their blood turned to poison, their bodies covered in the dark blotches that gave the Black Death its name. There was no surviving this form, none. The people, desperate for understanding, grasped at explanations. The physicians, trained in the ancient theories of Galen and Hippocrates, blamed an imbalance of humors. They believed the plague was caused by miasma, corrupted air, poisonous vapors rising from swamps or carried on evil winds. They were not entirely wrong. Disease does travel on the air, though not in the way they imagined. Some blamed the alignment of planets. In 1345, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn had formed a conjunction in the sign of Aquarius. Surely this astronomical event had disturbed the balance of the heavens and unleashed poison upon the earth. Others sought more tangible villains. Rumors spread that wells had been poisoned, that outsiders had deliberately spread the contagion. The Jews, already marginalized and mistrusted, became convenient scapegoats. In city after city, mobs rose up and slaughtered entire Jewish communities. The Pope himself issued bulls declaring the Jews innocent, pointing out that they too were dying of plague. It mattered little. Fear needs a target, and reason is its first casualty. The truth, of course, was far simpler and far more terrible. The plague was caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas that lived on rats. The black rat, Rattus rattus, was common throughout medieval Europe, thriving in the filthy conditions of crowded cities and towns. When an infected flea bit a human, it regurgitated the bacteria into the wound. The infection spread from there. But the people of the 14th century knew nothing of bacteria or vectors of disease. They knew only that death was everywhere, that it struck without warning or mercy, and that nothing they did seemed to stop it. The mortality rate was staggering. In some areas, half the population died. In others, even more. Entire villages were wiped out, their fields returning to wilderness, their buildings collapsing into ruin. Cities lost their vitality. The living were too few to maintain the complex systems of urban life. And yet, in the midst of this apocalypse, life continued. People still needed to eat, still needed shelter, still fell in love and had children. They went about their days with death as a constant companion, uncertain if they would see another sunrise. I watched them carry on with a kind of awed respect. In the face of such overwhelming horror, the human spirit showed itself capable of extraordinary resilience. But resilience alone was not enough. They needed knowledge, strategies, some way to fight back against an enemy they could not see or understand. And so they tried everything they could imagine. When faced with death on such a scale, people will try anything. I have seen this truth proven again and again across the ages, but never more clearly than during the Black Death. The remedies they attempted ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively harmful, born of desperation and fueled by fear. The physicians, those learned men who had studied at universities and could read Latin, approached the plague with the tools they had been given, the theories of ancient medicine. They believed the body contained for humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on these humors being in balance. Disease meant imbalance. The cure, therefore, was to restore equilibrium. For plague, this meant bloodletting. I watched physicians open veins and drain cups, sometimes pints, of blood from patients who were already weakened by fever and infection. They believed this would release the excess blood humor that was causing the symptoms. In reality, it only hastened death, robbing the body of the very strength it needed to fight. Leeches were applied to the buboes, their writhing bodies carefully placed to draw out the poison. Sometimes the doctors would lance the swellings with knives, trying to drain the pus and blood. If done correctly, this could occasionally help. Allowing the infection to drain might give the body a fighting chance, but more often it simply created new wounds that could become infected themselves. Purging was another favored treatment. Patients were given strong emetics to make them vomit, or purgatives to empty their bowels. The theory was that the disease would be expelled along with the body's waste. The result was dehydration and further weakness in people who desperately needed rest and nourishment. Some physicians prescribed theriac, a legendary cure-all that had been famous since ancient Roman times. It was a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients, herbs, spices, even powdered viper flesh. The recipe was a closely guarded secret, and it cost a fortune. Whether it did any good is doubtful, but it gave people something to cling to, and perhaps that alone had value. The common folk, unable to afford physicians or their expensive treatments, relied on their own remedies. They carried flowers and herbs, pomanders filled with aromatic substances, posies of lavender and rosemary. The rich might afford ambergris or musk. The idea was that sweet smells would drive away the corrupted air that carried disease. There is a dark irony here. The nursery rhyme "Ring Around the Rosy" is sometimes said to reference the plague, a pocket full of posies. Referring to these aromatic herbs, ashes to the cremation of bodies. We all fall down to death. Whether this is the true origin or merely a later invention matters little. The rhyme endures, a child's game built on the bones of millions. People burned fires constantly in their homes and in the streets. They ignited sulfur, believing its acrid smoke would purify the air. They shot cannons and rang bells, thinking the loud noises would break up the poisonous vapors. Some burned aromatic woods, cedar, juniper, pine, filling the air with fragrant smoke. None of it worked. The plague continued its relentless march. One of the most striking images I recall from those days was the plague doctor, dressed in his peculiar costume. The outfit was designed by Charles Delorme, physician to King Louis XIII, though not until the 17th century. But similar protective clothing was used during the Black Death as well. The doctors wore long waxed robes that covered them from neck to ankle. They wore wide-brimmed hats, marking them as physicians. Gloves protected their hands, and most distinctively, they wore a mask with a long, bird-like beak. The beak was not mere affectation. It was stuffed with aromatic substances, dried flowers, herbs, camphor, vinegar-soaked sponges. The doctors breathed through this beak, believing it would filter out the corrupted air. They carried long wooden canes, which they used to examine patients without touching them directly, or to point to things they needed. The costume was, in its way, partially effective, not because it filtered miasma, but because the heavy robes provided a barrier against flea bites. The beak kept them from breathing directly on patients, reducing the spread of pneumonic plague. But the doctors themselves did not understand why it worked, only that those who wore it sometimes survived, while those who did not often perished. For those who could afford it, the best remedy was flight. The wealthy fled the cities for their country estates, trying to outrun the contagion. There was even a saying, "Leave quickly, go far, return slowly." Get away from the infected areas. Travel to some place remote and do not return until you are certain the danger has passed. But even flight was no guarantee. The plague traveled faster than horses, carried by fleeing refugees who brought the infection with them. Remote villages and rural manors were not spared. The disease found them all eventually. For the poor who could not flee, Venice and other Italian city-states established lazarettos, plague hospitals, where the sick could be isolated from the healthy. These were grim places, warehouses of the dying, where patients received little more than water and prayers. But they served a purpose. By concentrating the infected in one place, they reduced the spread to the broader population. Still, for every measure that helped, there were a dozen that made things worse. In their terror, people turned on one another. The sick were abandoned by their own families. Parents fled their children, children their parents. Boccaccio, writing in Florence, described how brother abandoned brother, and the uncle his nephew, and the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. What is even worse, and nearly incredible, is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children as if they had not been theirs. The social fabric tore, trust dissolved. Communities that had functioned for centuries fractured under the strain, and through it all, the bodies mounted. In the first year alone, the plague killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe, a quarter of the population. By the time it finally burned itself out, sometime around 1353, as many as 50 million Europeans had died. Some regions lost 3/4 of their population. The world had never seen anything like it. Even I, who had witnessed the fall of empires and the destruction of cities, found myself awed by the sheer scale of the devastation. But humanity is nothing if not resilient. Even as the plague raged, even as death seemed certain, people found ways to adapt, to survive, to carry on. Their methods were often wrong, their understanding incomplete, but their determination to live. And in the end, that may have been the most effective remedy of all. In times of great suffering, people seek meaning. They need to believe their pain has purpose, that the universe is not simply random and cruel. During the Black Death, this search for meaning took many forms, some noble, some terrible, all utterly human. The Church taught that the plague was divine punishment for sin. This explanation had a certain logic to it. God was all-powerful and just. Therefore, if he allowed such suffering, it must be deserved. The question was not why the plague had come, but what sins had provoked it. Preachers thundered from their pulpits, calling for repentance. They pointed to the moral decay of society, the pride, the greed, the lust that infected every level of medieval life. They condemned the wealthy for their excess, the poor for their envy, the clergy for their corruption. Everyone was guilty. Everyone deserved punishment. And yet, God, in his mercy, had provided a path to salvation. Repent, pray, do penance, give to the Church. Perhaps then the plague would lift. The faithful responded with fervor. Church attendance swelled. Confessions multiplied. People gave what little they had to the Church, hoping their donations would purchase divine favor. They prayed for hours, their knees growing bloody on the cold stone floors of cathedrals. Some took penance to extremes. The flagellants appeared in 1348, first in Eastern Europe, then spreading rapidly westward. These were groups of men, sometimes hundreds strong, who traveled from town to town in organized processions, publicly whipping themselves as an act of extreme penance. I watched them enter a German town one autumn evening. They marched in two lines, stripped to the waist despite the cold, singing hymns in Latin and vernacular. When they reached the town square, they fell to their knees and began to beat themselves with leather whips tipped with metal studs. The sound was terrible, the crack of leather on flesh, the groans and cries of the flagellants, the gasps of the crowd that gathered to watch. Blood ran down their backs, staining their white leggings. They whipped themselves in a careful pattern, 3 times for simple sins, more for greater transgressions. Some collapsed from pain or blood loss. Others carried on until they could no longer lift their arms. They did this 3 times a day for 33 days, 1 day for each year of Christ's life. They believed their suffering could substitute for God's wrath, that their blood could wash away the sins that had brought the plague. The movement spread like wildfire. People were drawn to the spectacle, the intensity, the promise of action in the face of helplessness. If the Church's prayers were not working, perhaps this more extreme devotion would succeed. But the flagellants brought problems. They traveled in large groups, spreading the plague as they went, especially the pneumonic form, which passed easily in crowds. They became increasingly radical, claiming they did not need the Church or its sacraments. Some began to attack clergy who criticized them. They stirred up mobs against Jews and other outsiders. The Pope, Clement VI, initially tolerated the movement, but as it grew more extreme and more violent, he condemned it. In October of 1349, he issued a papal bull ordering the flagellants to disband. Many did, but others continued in secret, their movement fragmenting into dozens of smaller sects. The persecution of Jews intensified during these years. The accusations were absurd, that Jews had poisoned wells or used Christian blood in dark rituals to spread the plague. But logic mattered little to terrified mobs. In city after city, Jewish communities were attacked. Homes were burned. Families were dragged from their houses and murdered in the streets. In Strasbourg, in February of 1349, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the town square. In Mainz, 6,000 perished. In other cities, Jews were given the choice of conversion or death. Many chose to die. Pope Clement attempted to stop the persecutions. He issued multiple bulls pointing out that Jews were dying of plague at the same rate as Christians, which proved they were not responsible. He threatened excommunication for anyone who harmed Jews, but his words had little effect. Local authorities, when they intervened at all, often did so only to seize Jewish property for themselves. The plague became an excuse to settle old grievances, to eliminate competitors, to seize wealth. The veneer of civilization cracked, revealing the ugly prejudices that had always lurked beneath. Meanwhile, the clergy themselves were dying in droves. Priests and monks. In some dioceses, 40 to 60% of the clergy perished. Bishops, abbots, priests, they fell like wheat before the scythe. The loss was not just numerical, but qualitative. The most devout, the most dedicated, those who stayed at their posts and continued to minister to the dying, these were the ones most likely to contract the plague. Those clergy who survived were often the ones who had fled, abandoning their flocks in the hour of greatest need. This did not go unnoticed. The reputation of the church, already tarnished by corruption and worldliness, suffered further. If the church could not protect people from the plague, if even its most holy practitioners died despite their prayers and rituals, then what was its value? The spiritual crisis was profound. People began to question doctrines they had never thought to challenge. If the plague was punishment for sin, why did it kill the innocent, the babies, the children, the devout? Why did wicked men sometimes survive while saints perished? The answers the church provided seemed increasingly hollow. Some turned to superstition. Amulets and charms proliferated. People wore bags of herbs around their necks, carried rabbit's feet, inscribed protective symbols on their doors. They mixed Christian prayers with older folk magic, hedging their bets by appealing to every power they could name. Others turned to hedonism. If death could come at any moment, why not enjoy what time remained? Boccaccio's Decameron captures this mood. A group of young nobles fleeing Florence to escape the plague, passing their time in a countryside villa, telling Bodhi stories and enjoying pleasures of the flesh. Their laughter rang hollow against the backdrop of mass death, but it was laughter nonetheless, and some simply endured, carrying on with quiet faith that did not demand explanations. I remember a woman in a small English village, her name lost now even to me, who buried her husband and 3 children in the span of a week. She did not rail against God or curse the heavens. She simply dug the graves herself when no one else would help and placed flowers on the mounds. Then she returned to her cottage and continued living because there was no alternative. This quiet courage impressed me more than any grand gesture of faith or fury. She had no answers, expected none, but carried on anyway. The plague slowly began to recede in 1351, 1352. The worst had passed, though the disease would return in waves for centuries to come. Europe had been transformed. The population was halved. Villages stood empty. Fields lay fallow. Entire families had been erased from existence. But the survivors faced a new world, one where the old certainties had crumbled. The feudal system began to crack. With so many dead, labor became scarce and valuable. Peasants, who had always accepted their servitude, now found themselves able to demand wages, to negotiate, to move in search of better conditions. Lords who tried to maintain the old order found their workers simply leaving. The church, too, would never be the same. The plague had exposed its limitations. Within a century and a half, Martin Luther would nail his theses to a church door, and the Protestant Reformation would begin. The seeds of that transformation were sown in the plague years, when people learned that the church could not protect them and God's purposes remained inscrutable. But we are getting ahead of our story. The plague was not the only threat these medieval people faced. Even before the Black Death arrived, they had known another kind of suffering, one slower but equally devastating. They had known famine before the plague came, before the great dying began. The medieval world had already learned the terrible lessons of hunger. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had taught an entire generation what it meant to starve, and that knowledge did not fade. I want you to understand what famine truly means. It is not missing a meal or feeling hungry for an afternoon. It is a slow erosion of everything that makes you human. It is watching your body consume itself, your muscles wasting, your bones pressing against thinning skin. It is the constant ache in your belly that never goes away. The weakness that makes every step an effort. The fog that descends on your mind until thinking becomes as difficult as walking. And it is the choices, the terrible, impossible choices. During the Great Famine, when the grain stores emptied and the livestock died and the fields yielded nothing, people turned to what they called the 10 famine foods. These were not foods in any normal sense. They were substances that could be foraged from the forest and fields, things that could fill a belly and perhaps keep a person alive for another day. The first was nettles. In early spring, when the first green shoots appeared through the muddy earth, people would gather the young nettle tops. They had to be careful. Nettles sting fiercely when touched with bare hands. But boiled in water, the sting disappeared, and what remained was a bitter green soup that at least contained some nourishment. Iron, vitamin C, a small amount of protein. It tasted vile, but it was food. I watched a mother gather nettles on a cold March morning, her hands wrapped in rags against the stinging. Her children waited at home, hollow-eyed and quiet. She filled her apron with the green shoots, more than she could carry comfortably, because she did not know when she would find them again. That evening, the family ate nettle soup, silent around the fire. No one complained about the taste. They were simply grateful to have something warm in their bellies. The second was snails. After rain, snails could be gathered easily. They emerged from hiding to crawl across wet leaves and stones. They were small, each one barely a mouthful, but they were pure protein. People collected them by the hundreds, boiling them in their shells until the meat could be extracted with a pin. It took patience, sitting there for hours, picking tiny creatures from tiny shells. But patience was something the hungry had in abundance. Eels were the third famine food. In streams and marshes, eels could be caught with woven traps, or sometimes by hand, if you were quick and desperate enough. They were fatty, rich with the oils that human bodies craved. Smoked or dried, they could last for weeks. I saw men wade into freezing water up to their chests, groping in the mud for eels, their hands so cold they could barely feel what they caught. But an eel could feed. The sixth was burdock root. I remember watching people dig for these thick roots that burrowed deep into the ground, requiring real effort to extract. The roots had to be sliced thin, soaked for hours to remove some of their bitterness, then boiled until soft. They provided bulk, something to chew, the illusion of fullness. But they were fibrous and tough, and eating too many gave people terrible stomach cramps. Still, cramps were better than starvation. The seventh was sorrel. These sour-tasting leaves grew wild in meadows and along roadsides. They could be eaten raw, though they made your mouth pucker, or boiled into soups. The tartness came from oxalic acid, dangerous in large quantities, but in small amounts it provided vitamin C and helped prevent scurvy. People learned to balance sourness with whatever else they could find, mixing sorrel with nettles or dandelion greens to make the combination barely palatable. The eighth was mushrooms. This was a dangerous food, for many mushrooms are poisonous. Every village had stories of families who died in agony after eating the wrong ones. But those who knew, the old women who had learned from their mothers, who had foraged for decades, they could identify the safe ones. After rain, mushrooms sprouted from rotting logs and damp earth. They provided flavor, if nothing else, a taste of something beyond mere survival. I recall an old woman in Bavaria who led foraging expeditions into the forest. She walked slowly, her back bent with age, but her eyes were sharp. She knew every mushroom, every edible plant, every source of food the forest held. People followed her like disciples, trusting their lives to her knowledge. She saved many that way, but even she could not stretch the forest's bounty to feed an entire village. The ninth was hawthorn berries. In late summer and autumn, hawthorn bushes bore small red berries. They were tart, full of seeds, but they could be cooked down into thick pastes or dried for winter. They provided fiber and vitamin C. Children were sent to gather them, returning with scratched hands and arms from the thorns, but with baskets of the small red fruits. Every berry counted. The 10th, and perhaps most desperate, was bark bread. When even the famine foods ran out, people turned to tree bark. Not the outer bark, which was inedible, but the inner layer, the cambium, which carried nutrients through the tree. They peeled it away in strips, dried it, ground it into powder, and mixed it with whatever flour they still had. I tasted bark bread once, in a village so remote, even I had difficulty finding it. The bread was gray, gritty, almost impossible to chew. It scraped your throat going down and sat like a stone in your stomach. It provided almost no nutrition, just bulk, something to trick your body into thinking it had eaten. Many who survived on barked bread later suffered from intestinal blockages. But when the alternative was watching your children cry from hunger, you fed them bark bread and prayed. Beyond these 10 foods, people ate things that barely deserved the name. Boiled leather from old shoes, softened in water until it could be chewed. Straw, though it provided nothing but bulk, and often caused internal damage. Ground bones from animals long dead, boiled into a thin broth. Moss scraped from rocks. Dirt mixed with water to create a paste that filled the belly for a few hours. And then there were the whispers, the rumors that circulated in the darkest hours, spoken only in fearful murmurs. Stories of people who had turned to the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. I cannot say how many such stories were true and how many were merely the horrified imaginings of desperate minds. But I know that some were real. I saw evidence, evidence I will not describe in detail, for some things should not be remembered too clearly. Parents abandoned children they could not feed, leaving them at monastery gates or simply in the forest, hoping someone else might save them. Children watched their parents waste away, helpless to do anything but wait for their turn. Families broke apart, villages fractured. The social bonds that had held communities together for generations dissolved under the pressure of starvation. Some tried to escape. They walked to towns, hoping to find work, food, anything. But the towns were full of refugees, all equally desperate. Beggars lined the streets. Bodies lay in alleys. The living stumbled past the dead without pausing, too exhausted to care. The feudal system trembled. Lords demanded their taxes, even as their peasants starved. But what could be taken from people who had nothing? Some lords showed mercy, distributing grain from their stores. Others did not, hoarding their supplies while their tenants died. The resentment festered. Seeds were planted, not in fields, but in hearts that would one day grow into rebellion. The church tried to help. Monasteries and convents opened their doors, feeding as many as they could. But their stores, too, were finite. Monks and nuns starved alongside the people they tried to save. Mass graves were dug outside monastery walls. The death toll climbed, and yet, somehow, people survived. Not all of them. Millions died. But enough clung to life, sustained by nettles and acorns, and bark and sheer, stubborn will. They learned what the human body could endure. They discovered reserves of strength they never knew existed. When the rains finally ceased, when the sun returned and the crops began to grow again, the survivors emerged thinner, weaker, but alive. They had been tested in ways that broke many of them, but they had not broken entirely. The experience marked them. An entire generation grew up knowing famine intimately. They never wasted food. They stored everything they could. They eyed the sky with suspicion every spring, waiting for the rains that might signal another disaster. They told their children about the famine years, trying to pass on the hard lessons they had learned. But memory fades. By the time the Black Death arrived, 30 years after the famine ended, a new generation had grown. They had heard the stories, but not lived them. They thought they knew hardship. They had no idea what was coming. The plague would teach them that there are many ways to die, and starvation, terrible as it is not the worst. As the plague raged and famine returned in waves, a few measures began to show promise. Not cures, there were no cures, not then, but methods of slowing the spread, of buying time, of keeping death at bay for a few more days. These measures saved some, though they came at a terrible cost. The Italian city-states, with their experience in trade and their exposure to diseases from the East, led the way in developing public health responses. Venice, Milan, Florence, these cities had wealth and organization. They could implement policies that smaller towns could not. Quarantine was the most effective measure. When ships arrived from infected regions, they were forced to anchor offshore, their crews and passengers forbidden from landing. At first, the waiting period was short, a few days, but it became clear that the disease could hide, showing no symptoms for longer than expected. The waiting period extended, first 14 days, then 20, finally 40 quarantino in Italian, from which we get our word quarantine. I stood on the docks of Venice and watched a merchant ship rock at anchor just beyond the harbor. The crew, visible on deck, waved frantically at the shore. They shouted that they were healthy, that they had seen no plague, that their cargo was valuable and would spoil if left too long. The harbor master ignored them. The law was absolute: 40 days. On the 37th day, a crew member collapsed on deck. By the 40th day, half the crew was dead. The ship was burned, cargo and all, the smoke rising black against the sky. The harbor master watched with no expression. He had saved his city, but at the cost of 24 lives. Those who showed symptoms in the cities were taken to lazarettos, plague hospitals, established on islands or in isolated buildings outside the city walls. These were grim places. The sick were brought in on carts, often already dying. They were placed in large rooms, dozens together, with minimal care, water, if available, prayers from priests, brave or foolish enough to venture inside, little else. The lazarettos were not hospitals in any modern sense. They were warehouses of death, places to isolate the infected from the healthy. The mortality rate inside them approached 90%, but the cities that established them saw their overall death rates drop. By concentrating the plague in one location, they prevented it from spreading through every neighborhood. The cost was borne by those taken to the lazarettos. They went knowing they would likely never return. Families said goodbye forever at the doors. Children wept as their parents were loaded onto carts. But the alternative, allowing the plague to rampage unchecked, was worse. Milan took even harsher measures. When plague was detected in a household, the authorities did not simply mark the door. They sealed the entire building, boarding up windows and doors with the entire family inside, healthy and sick together. Food was passed through small openings. No one was allowed to leave. The healthy members of the household, trapped with infected relatives, often contracted the disease themselves. Entire families died behind those boarded-up doors. But the plague did not spread to neighboring houses. Milan's death rate, while terrible, was lower than cities that took less extreme measures. I watched one such ceiling in Milan on a cold November morning. A young woman stood at a window as workers nailed boards across it, entombing her with her dying husband and 2 children. She did not scream or plead. She simply watched, her face pale and still. A week later, I passed the house again. No sounds came from within. The family was gone. These methods worked after a fashion, but they required something that many communities lacked: strong, centralized authority capable of enforcing unpopular rules. In villages and smaller towns, where everyone knew everyone, it was harder to seal away your neighbor's family or refuse entry to a merchant you had known for years. Human sympathy, that quality which makes us human, became a liability. The plague exploited our best instincts, the desire to care for the sick, to comfort the dying, to give proper burial to the dead. Every act of compassion was an opportunity for transmission. Some tried to wall themselves off entirely. Wealthy families retreated to remote estates, bringing only trusted servants, sealing the gates behind them. They waited, insulated from the world, hoping the plague would pass them by. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes a single servant, unknowingly infected, brought death inside the walls. Anyway, the poor had no such options. They could not flee. They could not isolate. They lived in cramped quarters, entire families in single rooms, often sharing walls with other families. When plague entered such places, It moved like fire through dry straw. The disposal of bodies became a critical problem. Traditional burial practices involved washing the body, holding a wake, carrying the corpse to the church for funeral rites, then interring it in consecrated ground with proper ceremony. But when hundreds died daily, such practices became impossible. Bodies were collected by special workers, the Bikino corpse bearers, often criminals or desperate men willing to risk infection for pay. They moved through the streets with carts, calling for people to bring out their dead. The bodies were taken to mass graves, enormous pits dug on the outskirts of towns. Sometimes there was a priest to say a prayer. Often there was not. The bodies were simply dumped in layers, covered with lime to slow decomposition and reduce the stench. I watched these burials with a heavy heart. Each body in those pits had been a person, had a name, a story, people who loved them. Now they were anonymous, piled together without dignity or remembrance. It violated everything medieval people believed about death and the afterlife. The lack of proper burial rites caused spiritual anguish almost as great as the physical suffering of the plague itself. Air purification efforts, while based on incorrect theories, sometimes helped. The fires lit in streets and homes, the aromatic smoke, the ventilation, these did not purify corrupted air, but they did drive away fleas. The smoke made buildings less hospitable to rats. Unintentionally, people were attacking the real vectors of disease. The flight of the wealthy, too, These lessons came at an enormous price. The social fabric was shredded. Families were destroyed. Trust evaporated. People learned to fear their neighbors, to see every stranger as a potential carrier of death. The warm communal life of medieval villages and towns gave way to suspicion and isolation. And yet they survived. The plague slowly burned itself out, helped by quarantine measures, by isolation, by the brutal arithmetic of death. It killed so many so quickly that it ran out of easy targets. The most susceptible died first. Those with some natural resistance survived and passed that resistance to their children. The bacteria itself may have evolved toward a less virulent form. After all, a disease that kills its host too quickly cannot spread efficiently. By 1353, the worst was over. The Black Death had done its terrible work. Europe was transformed, depopulated, traumatized, but still alive. The survivors faced a world they barely recognized. Half their neighbors were gone. Fields lay empty. Buildings crumbled, but they were alive, and that meant something. They had learned hard lessons, that prevention was better than cure, that isolation could stop disease, that strong authority, while harsh, could save lives. These lessons would be forgotten and relearned many times over the coming centuries. But they had been learned once, written in the blood of millions. The plague would return many times, in 1361, 1369, 1374, and periodically for the next 4 centuries. But it never again reached the apocalyptic scale of the Black Death. Humanity had adapted. The most vulnerable had died. The survivors carried resistance in their blood. But survival came at a cost that cannot be measured in numbers alone. The world that emerged from the plague years was darker, harder, more suspicious. The naive trust of the early Middle Ages was gone. In its place came a grimmer wisdom that the world was dangerous, that death could come at any moment, and that survival required vigilance, sacrifice, and sometimes terrible choices. They learned that lesson well, too well. perhaps. The Black Death was not the only disease that haunted medieval lives. It was merely the most dramatic, the most devastating. But plague was one shadow among many. I walked through those centuries and watched as other illnesses picked away at humanity, each claiming its victims, each teaching its lessons. Smallpox was ancient, older even than civilization itself. I had seen it in Rome in the 2nd century, when the plague of the Antonines swept through the empire. Perhaps it was smallpox that struck then. The accounts are unclear, lost in the confusion of dying empires and falling civilizations. But I know the disease well. The fever, the distinctive rash that began on the face and spread across the body, the pustules that erupted from the skin, leaving survivors scarred for life. In medieval Europe, smallpox was endemic, always present, claiming victims steadily rather than in dramatic waves. Children were especially vulnerable. A village might lose a quarter of its children to smallpox in a bad year. Those who survived were marked forever, their faces pocked with scars, but they gained immunity. Smallpox did not strike the same person twice. I remember a young woman in England, beautiful before the disease took her. She survived, but her face was ruined, cratered with scars. Her betrothed broke their engagement. She never married. In that time, a woman's appearance was often her only currency, and smallpox stole that from many. The disease was democratic in some ways. It struck rich and poor alike, but cruel in its particular preferences. It loved children and beautiful women especially, or so it seemed. Tuberculosis, consumption, they called it, or phthisis, was a slower killer. It attacked the lungs primarily, causing a wasting disease that could take months or years to kill. Victims coughed blood, lost weight, grew pale and ethereal. There was something almost romantic about consumption in later centuries, as if the disease elevated its victims somehow. But in medieval times, there was no romance. Only the gradual dissolution of the body, the lungs slowly destroyed, the victim drowning in their own fluids. Tuberculosis thrived in crowded conditions. In growing medieval towns, where families lived in close quarters, where ventilation was poor and sunlight scarce, the disease spread easily. It passed from person to person, through coughing, through shared cups and bedding, through the very air. No one understood how it spread. They only knew that it did, that one case often led to another, that entire families could be wiped out over the course of a few years. Leprosy inspired a particular horror. The disease, caused by a bacterium related to tuberculosis, attacked the skin and nerves. It progressed slowly, sometimes over decades. Victims developed lesions on their skin. Their fingers and toes became numb, then deformed. In severe cases, limbs could literally fall away, the flesh rotting, while the person still lived. Medieval people believed leprosy was divine punishment for sin, particularly sexual sin. Lepers were outcasts, forced to live apart from society in special colonies called leper houses or lazar houses. When they ventured out, they had to ring a bell or carry a clapper to warn others of their approach. They were forbidden from entering churches, markets, or any public space. Even their families often abandoned them. I visited a leper colony in France, a collection of crude huts outside a town whose name I have forgotten. The inhabitants lived in a kind of suspended death, neither fully alive nor yet in the grave. They tended small gardens, prayed in their own chapel, waited for the end. Some had been there for years, even decades. They received charity, bread left at the gates, cast-off clothes, occasional coins, but they were cut off from human warmth and touch. No one wanted to risk contamination. The cruelty of it struck me deeply. Leprosy is actually not very contagious. Prolonged close contact is required for transmission, and many people have natural immunity. But medieval people did not know this. They saw the horrific symptoms and assumed the disease was easily spread, and so they exiled their own family members, their neighbors, condemning them to lives of isolation. Typhus and relapsing fever, often lumped together as famine fever, came in the wake of hunger and war. These diseases were spread by lice, which thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of famine and military campaigns. Armies were particularly vulnerable. More soldiers died of typhus than combat in many medieval wars. The symptoms began with sudden high fever, terrible headaches, and a distinctive rash. Victims became delirious, their minds consumed by fever. Many died. Those who survived were left weakened, vulnerable to other infections. The disease appeared wherever people were pressed together in misery, in besieged cities, in refugee camps, in the slums of growing towns. I walked through a military camp in Germany during one of the endless wars of the 14th century. Half the soldiers were sick with typhus. They lay in their tents, burning with fever, crying out in delirium. The healthy soldiers tried to maintain distance, but lice do not respect such boundaries. They moved from man to man, carrying their invisible cargo. Within a month, the army had to retreat. Not because of enemy action, but because too many men were too sick to fight. Dysentery was common, especially in summer. Contaminated water carried the disease. Symptoms were brutal: severe diarrhea, often bloody, accompanied by cramps and fever. Dehydration killed quickly, especially children and the elderly. Every summer brought new outbreaks. Every summer, people watched their loved ones waste away, their bodies unable to retain any moisture. I cannot count how many children I saw die of dysentery. The illness was particularly cruel to the young. A healthy child could sicken and die within days. Parents would do everything they could, boil water, if they knew to, pray to Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian. Offer anything they had to save their child. Usually, it was not enough. Malaria lingered in marshy regions, carried by mosquitoes that bred in stagnant water. The disease caused cycling fevers, burning heat, followed by terrible chills, over and over. It sapped strength, left victims weak and anemic. In areas where malaria was common, people simply accepted it as part of life. You had the fever every summer. Sometimes it killed you. Usually, it just made you miserable for weeks. Then there was ergotism, called St. Anthony's fire. This was not caused by an infection, but by a fungus that grew on rye grain in wet conditions. When people ate bread made from infected rye, they were poisoned. The ergot alkaloids caused hallucinations, convulsions, and a burning sensation in the limbs. In severe cases, blood flow to extremities was cut off, and fingers and toes turned black and had to be amputated if the victim survived at all. I witnessed an outbreak of ergotism in a French village after a particularly wet harvest. The entire village seemed to go mad at once. People saw visions, claimed to see demons and angels. Some danced uncontrollably. Others screamed about the burning in their hands and feet. Several died. Those who survived lost fingers, toes, sometimes entire limbs. The village priest believed it was demonic possession. He performed exorcisms, which of course did nothing. Eventually, someone made the connection between the illness and the previous year's rye crop. The contaminated grain was burned and the outbreak ceased. But the memory lingered, woven into local folklore about curses and divine wrath. And then, in the late 15th century, a new disease appeared suddenly and spread with terrifying speed. Syphilis, the great pox, they called it, to distinguish it from smallpox. No one knew where it came from. Some blamed sailors returning from the New World. Others thought it had always existed, but suddenly became more virulent. The disease was sexually transmitted, and it progressed in stages. The initial infection caused sores. Then came a rash, fever, and aches. These symptoms would fade, and the victim might think themselves cured, but the disease was only hiding. Years later, it would return in its tertiary stage, destroying bones, organs, and eventually the brain. Victims went mad, their bodies rotting from within. The stigma attached to syphilis was enormous. It was seen as punishment for sexual sin, a mark of shame that branded its victims. Treatment was brutal. Mercury compounds that poisoned as much as they cured. Sweating regimes that dehydrated patients, sometimes bloodletting. Nothing truly worked. The disease ran its course over years or decades. A slow agony. I could continue this litany of suffering. Influenza, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever. Each disease claimed its victims. Each taught people to fear, to mourn, to carry on despite loss. Medieval life was lived in the constant presence of disease. Everyone knew someone who had died young, who had been carried off by fever or wasting illness or sudden plague. And yet people adapted. They learned which illnesses were contagious and which were not. They developed folk remedies that sometimes helped willow bark for fever, honey for coughs, various herbs for various ailments. Most remedies did nothing, but the act of trying gave comfort. The belief that you could do something, anything, made the helplessness bearable. They also learned acceptance. Not fatalism exactly, but a kind of practical acknowledgement that death was part of life, that children might not grow to adulthood, that health could vanish in a moment. They loved deeply, knowing love could be torn away. They made plans, knowing those plans might come to nothing. They lived fully and intensely because they understood how fragile life was. This was their true survival strategy, not the herbs or the prayers or the quarantines, important as those were. It was the ability to continue to love and work and hope despite the constant presence of death, to rebuild after loss, to carry on when carrying on seemed impossible. They were stronger than they knew, stronger, perhaps, than we can imagine from our comfortable distance in time. The sun is setting as I finish this tale, casting long shadows across the centuries between their time and yours. I have told you of plague and famine, of suffering beyond measure, of darkness that seemed it might never lift. But there is more to this story than death. The medieval people who survived these crises were changed by them, yes, but they were not broken. From the ashes of the Black Death and the hunger of the Great Famine, a new world began to emerge. The feudal system, which had seemed eternal and unchangeable, began to crumble. With half the population dead, Labor became scarce and therefore valuable. Peasants who had... There were cultural shifts too. Art became darker, more focused on death and its inevitability. The danse macabre, the dance of death, appeared in paintings and literature, showing death leading away people of all ranks, from emperors to peasants. Death was the great equalizer, the one power that respected neither wealth nor status. But there was also a new intensity to life. Having seen how quickly it could end, people embraced the time they had more fully. The late medieval period saw an explosion of art, literature, architecture. The Renaissance was coming, built on the ruins of the plague years. The medical knowledge gain, such as it was, persisted. The concept of quarantine became established practice. The idea of public health, that authorities had a responsibility to protect their populations from disease, took root. These concepts would develop over centuries into modern medicine and epidemiology. The survivors passed on their knowledge to their children. They taught them about the famine foods, about the importance of storing grain, about watching for signs of plague. They told stories about the great dying, stories meant to educate and warn. Those stories became legends, then myths, but the kernel of truth remained, and they continued. This, perhaps, is what impresses me most. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and then planted crops for the next season. They rebuilt their homes, their villages, their lives. They fell in love, had children, found joy where they could. They laughed again, eventually. They sang, they danced. Human resilience is a remarkable thing. I have watched it across millennia, seen it proven again and again. Push people to the very edge of extinction, and some will find a way to survive. Give them even the smallest reason to hope, and they will build a future on that hope. The medieval peasant who ate nettle soup and bark bread, who watched neighbors die of plague, who lost children to hunger and disease, that peasant woke each morning and chose to continue, chose to tend the field, to feed the animals, to repair the roof, chose to live despite everything life had taken from them. That choice, repeated millions of times across generations, is how humanity survived its darkest hours, not through grand gestures or brilliant strategies, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to give up, through the small acts of courage that fill ordinary days. We carry their strength in us still. Their blood runs in our veins, quite literally. Everyone of European descent is the product of survivors, people who lived through plague and famine and somehow passed their lives forward. We exist because they endured. When you face your own dark times, and you will, for life guarantees nothing else, remember them. Remember the peasant eating bark bread and choosing to hope for spring. Remember the mother burying her children and finding the strength to go on. Remember the priest who stayed when he could have fled. The physician who treated the sick knowing he would likely die. The ordinary person who simply continued because there was no alternative. They had no vaccines, no antibiotics, no understanding of germs or viruses. They had only their will to survive and their ability to love despite loss. It was enough. Barely, terribly, but enough. The medieval world died with the Black Death. The world that came after was shaped by those who survived it. Harder, wiser, more questioning, less naive about divine protection, more aware of their own agency. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the birth of modern science, all of these grew from seeds planted during the plague years. when people learned that they could not simply pray and obey, but must think and question and act. And so the great dying, terrible as it was, became also a kind of birth. The old world passed away. The new world struggled to be born. In that struggle, in that painful transition, our modern age had its beginning. I have lived long enough to see the wheel turn many times. Plagues come and go. Famines rise and recede. Each generation faces its trials. What changes is not the suffering. Suffering is the human condition, but how we respond to it. The medieval people showed us one way to respond, with courage, with stubborn persistence, with love fierce enough to survive loss. Their way was not perfect. They made mistakes, terrible ones, but they endured, and their endurance made possible everything that came after, including you, dear listener, sitting here now, safe and warm, listening to an old story of old suffering. You exist because they refused to surrender. You carry their victory in your very being that is worth remembering. And thus ends another memory from ages long past. If you have found a spark of wonder here, stay a while longer, for there are countless tales yet to be remembered. There are diseases that kill with drama, that announce themselves with buboes and blood and unmistakable signs. And then there are diseases that kill with indignity, that strip away not just life, but dignity itself, that turn the body into a vessel of humiliation before finally releasing it to death. Cholera was such a disease. I first encountered it in India, long before it reached European shores. The year was 1817, and the disease emerged from the Ganges Delta like a dark flood, spreading along trade routes and pilgrimage paths. It moved with the caravans and ships, patient and inexorable, following the ancient pathways of commerce that connected the East to the West. By 1831, it had reached Europe. I stood on the docks of Hamburg and watched a merchant ship arrive from the Baltic ports. The crew stumbled off the gangplank, their faces hollow, their movements weak. 3 of them collapsed before they reached the customs house. By nightfall, they were dead. Within a week, the disease had spread through the port district like fire through dry timber. Cholera killed differently than plague. There were no buboes, no blood-filled coughs, no blackened limbs. Instead, it attacked the intestines with savage efficiency. The symptoms began suddenly, violent diarrhea that seemed to drain the very life from the body. Not ordinary diarrhea, but a watery discharge that physicians called rice water stool because of its pale flecked appearance. The fluid loss was catastrophic. A healthy adult could lose gallons. I watched a young woman die of cholera in London in 1832. She had been healthy that morning, laughing with friends at the market. By afternoon, she was violently ill. By evening, she was unrecognizable, her face gaunt and aged, her lips drawn back from her teeth, her body racked with cramps as her muscles, deprived of fluids, contracted in agony. She died before midnight, less than 12 hours after the first symptoms appeared. The mortality rate was staggering. Half of those who contracted cholera died, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms. Entire households could be wiped out in a day. Streets that bustled with life in the morning were silent by evening. The only sounds, the moans of the dying and the rumble of death carts. What made cholera particularly terrifying was its seeming randomness. Unlike plague, which spread through obvious contact, cholera appeared to strike without pattern. One house would be devastated while its neighbor remained untouched. One family would lose every member while another, living in identical conditions, remained healthy. The physicians of the early 19th century were as baffled as their medieval predecessors had been by plague. They still clung to miasma theory, believing that cholera spread through bad air, through the stench of sewage and rot that pervaded the growing industrial cities. And in a way, they were not entirely wrong. Cholera did correlate with filth and poverty, but they had the mechanism backwards. I watched them implement their remedies. They lit fires in the streets, trying to purify the air. They fumigated houses with sulfur and vinegar. They distributed aromatic substances for people to carry and breathe through. None of it worked. The cholera continued its relentless march. Some physicians advocated bloodletting, that ancient and terrible remedy. They believed that by draining blood, they could remove the corrupted humors causing the disease. In reality, they were removing the very fluids the body desperately needed to retain. Patients who were bled almost always died, their bodies unable to recover from the dual assault of disease and treatment. Others prescribed opium to stop the diarrhea. This sometimes helped, slowing the fluid loss enough to give the body time to fight. But opium was expensive, and the doses required were large. The poor could not afford it. They simply suffered, their bodies emptying themselves until there was nothing left. The death was peculiar in its horror. Cholera victims remained conscious almost to the very end, trapped in bodies that were systematically shutting down. Their minds stayed clear, even as their organs failed. They knew they were dying. They could feel it happening. They remained aware through the muscle cramps, the desperate thirst, the cold creeping through their extremities as circulation collapsed. And then, suddenly, they would die. The heart, starved of fluids and electrolytes, would simply stop. There was no gradual fading, no peaceful release. One moment, conscious suffering, the next, stillness. I remember the terror this inspired. People were afraid not just of death, but of this particular death. To die of cholera was considered shameful, degrading. The disease attacked the most private functions of the body, turned them into public spectacle. Victims soiled themselves uncontrollably. The smell was overwhelming, inescapable. Even in death, there was no dignity. The bodies remained twisted in the positions their final cramps had forced them into. The social impact was profound. Cholera, like plague before it, exposed the fault lines in society. It struck hardest in the poorest neighborhoods, where people lived crowded together, where sanitation was primitive or non-existent, where clean water was a luxury few could afford. The wealthy fled the cities when cholera arrived, retreating to country estates where the air was clean and the water pure. The poor had no such option. They stayed and died in numbers that shocked even those inured to urban mortality. In Paris, in 1832, I walked through neighborhoods where half the population had perished. Bodies lay in the streets because there were not enough living to bury the dead. The authorities hired workers, desperate men willing to risk infection for wages, to collect the corpses. They were given brandy to dull their senses and gloves to protect their hands, as if such measures could ward off a disease they did not understand. The mass graves were reminiscent of the plague years, enormous pits lined with lime. But unlike plague, where death came to all classes, cholera was selective in a way that made its victims feel abandoned. The rich survived, the poor died. The message was clear, even if no one said it aloud. Some lives mattered more than others. And yet, slowly, understanding began to dawn. Not among all physicians, but but among a few perceptive ones who looked past theory to observe reality. In London, a physician named John Snow, though this was years later, in 1854, conducted an investigation that would change medicine forever. There was an outbreak of cholera in Soho, concentrated around Broad Street. Snow mapped the cases, plotting each death on a chart of the neighborhood. He noticed something remarkable. The deaths clustered around a particular water pump on Broad Street. Those who drank from that pump sickened and died. Those who used other pumps remained healthy. Snow examined the pump and found nothing obviously wrong. But he investigated further, tracing the water supply. He discovered that a cesspit, a hole in the ground where human waste was dumped, was located near the well that fed the pump. The cesspit had cracked. Sewage was seeping into the water supply. He convinced the authorities to remove the pump handle, making it impossible to draw water from that source. The outbreak ceased almost immediately. This was revolutionary. Snow had demonstrated, through careful observation and logic, that cholera was not caused by bad air, but by contaminated water. The disease was waterborne. It spread when human waste, containing the bacteria, entered the water supply and was then consumed by others. The implications were enormous. If cholera spread through water, then the solution was not fumigation or bloodletting, but sanitation, clean water, proper sewage disposal, hygiene, simple measures, but ones that required massive infrastructure investment and a fundamental rethinking of urban planning. Not everyone accepted Snow's findings immediately. I watched London transform over the following decades. The great sewers were built, massive tunnels that carried waste away from the city rather than dumping it into the Thames. Clean water was piped to neighborhoods that had never had it before. The cholera epidemics, which had returned every few years like clockwork, began to fade. But the lessons came too late for millions. Between 1817 and the end of the century, cholera killed hundreds of millions worldwide. The 19th century saw 7 major pandemics, each one sweeping across continents, leaving devastation in its wake. In India, where the disease originated, the death toll was almost impossible to calculate. Entire villages were emptied. Pilgrimage sites became death traps. The sacred rivers, carrying not just spiritual renewal, but microscopic killers. The Ganges, that holy waterway, was a highway for cholera, carrying the disease from village to village, region to region. The disease reached the Americas, carried in the holds of ships. It swept through cities, barely recovered from yellow fever. It traveled west with settlers and gold seekers, following the wagon trains and river routes. Native populations, already devastated by smallpox and other introduced diseases, fell before cholera in terrible numbers. I walked through a cholera camp in California during the gold rush years. The miners, living in squalid conditions along polluted streams, died in their hundreds. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves that the winter rains would later wash away. Even in death, there was no rest, no permanence, just the endless cycle of disease and decay. What strikes me most, looking back across those pandemic years, is how long it took for the simple truth to be accepted. Clean water prevents cholera. Proper sanitation stops its spread. These facts were demonstrable, provable, obvious once you looked at the evidence. And yet people resisted. They clung to old theories because they were comfortable, because they required no change, because accepting the truth meant acknowledging that cities had been built wrong, that lives had been lost unnecessarily, that the deaths of millions might have been prevented with basic infrastructure. The resistance to change was not scientific, but economic and political. Building sewers was expensive. Providing clean water required massive investment. The wealthy, whose neighborhoods already had better sanitation, saw little reason to spend money on improvements for the poor. And the poor themselves had no voice, no power to demand better. It took cholera, that great equalizer that killed rich and poor alike, when it found contaminated water, to force change. Even then, progress was slow, grudging, incomplete. Many cities did not invest in proper sanitation until the 20th century. Some still have not. I have lived long enough to see cholera nearly eradicated from the developed world. Clean water and sanitation made it a relic of the past in Europe and North America. But in poorer regions, where infrastructure remains inadequate, cholera still strikes. The disease that could have been conquered in the 19th century still kills, still spreads, still reminds us that knowledge is useless without the will to act on it. The cholera years taught humanity a crucial lesson: that diseases do not respect social boundaries, that public health requires public investment, that preventing disease is not just a matter of individual behavior, but of collective infrastructure. The medieval world had learned to isolate the sick. The modern world had to learn to prevent sickness before it began. It was a hard lesson, bought with millions of lives. And like so many hard lessons, it had to be learned again and again, in different times and places, as each generation forgot what the previous one had paid so dearly to discover. But for those who survived, for those who saw their cities transform from disease-ridden warrens to cleaner, safer places, the victory was sweet. They had defeated a plague, not with prayers or magic, but with reason and effort. They had proven that humanity could fight back against disease, could change the world to make it safer. It was a beginning, only a beginning, but an important one. The age of modern medicine was dawning, built on the foundations laid by those who had suffered through cholera and plague and famine and learned, slowly, painfully, how to fight back. As I near the end of this long recollection, I find myself thinking not about the diseases themselves, but about what they taught. Every epidemic, every famine, every brush with mass death left lessons written in the bones of survivors. Some of those lessons were learned. Others were forgotten and had to be relearned centuries later at terrible cost. The medieval world, facing plague and famine without understanding either, did the best they could with the knowledge they had. They isolated the sick, not knowing about bacteria, but understanding that distance helped. They implemented quarantine, not knowing about incubation periods, but recognizing that waiting revealed the healthy from the infected. They improved sanitation during plague years, not understanding disease vectors, but noticing that cleaner cities fared slightly better. These measures were primitive, inconsistent, often ineffective, but they were the seeds of public health. The first stumbling steps toward understanding disease as something that could be controlled rather than simply endured. I walked through a hospital in Florence in 1350, shortly after the worst of the Black Death had passed. The building had been a monastery before the plague. Now it was dedicated to caring for the sick, one of the first such institutions in Europe. The monks who ran it had noticed something during the plague years, that caring for the ill in one central location, rather than leaving them scattered in their homes, seemed to slow the spread of disease. They did not know why. They did not understand that isolation prevented the pneumonic form of plague from spreading through households. they only knew it worked. And so they continued, turning their monastery into a place of healing, however crude their methods might have been. This pattern repeated across Europe. Hospitals, rudimentary by any modern standard, began to appear. Not as places to cure disease that was beyond their capability, but as places to care for the sick, to isolate contagion, to provide comfort in dying. It was something, a small something, but more than had existed before. The famine years taught different lessons. They taught the importance of food storage, of diversifying crops, of not pushing agriculture beyond the land's capacity. Villages that had stored grain from good years survived the bad ones. Those that had spent everything, assuming plenty would continue, starved. I remember a village in England, its name long forgotten even by the land itself, that survived the Great Famine better than its neighbors. The village elder, a woman of uncommon foresight, had insisted on building larger granaries after a particularly good harvest in 1310. She had been mocked for it. Why store food when the fields were so productive? Why not sell the surplus and enjoy the profit? But when the rains came and the harvests failed, that village had reserves. They rationed carefully, making the stores last through the worst years. They still suffered, still lost people to hunger, but they survived as a community, while villages around them were abandoned entirely. After the famine ended, other villages built larger granaries. They remembered. For a generation, perhaps two, they remembered. Then memory faded, replaced by the assumption that plenty was normal, that famine was something that happened in the past but not the present. The granaries fell into disrepair, and when the next famine came, because famine always comes eventually, they were unprepared again. This is the tragedy of human memory. We learn from suffering, but we forget as soon as the suffering ends. Each generation must relearn what the previous one knew, must pay again the price in blood and hunger and grief. The plague years also taught about the importance of social cohesion, though it was a paradoxical lesson. Communities that maintained bonds of trust and mutual aid survived better than those that fractured into fear and isolation. And yet, the very measures that helped control plague, quarantine, isolation, avoidance of contact, tore at those social bonds. I watched villages navigate this contradiction. In some places, people found ways to help one another while maintaining distance. They left food at doorsteps for quarantined families. They checked on the isolated through windows. They found ways to express care without physical contact. In other places, fear won. Families abandoned their sick members. Neighbors refused to acknowledge one another. The social fabric that had held communities together for generations dissolved in a matter of weeks. These communities, even when they survived physically, were broken in ways that took generations to heal. The strongest communities were those that found a middle path. They took precautions seriously, but did not abandon their humanity. They isolated the sick, but did not abandon them. They maintained distance, but not coldness. It required wisdom and courage in equal measure. I think of a priest I knew in Germany during the Black Death. Father Heinrich, his name was Plague, came to his parish. He did not flee as many clergy did, but neither did he expose himself foolishly. He ministered to the sick through windows and doorways. He heard confessions from a distance. He conducted burials quickly with minimal ceremony, recognizing that gathering crowds would spread the disease further. His parishioners mocked him for his caution, called him a coward for not entering the homes of the dying. But he survived, and because he survived, he was able to continue serving his community long after bolder priests had died. Sometimes wisdom looks like cowardice until hindsight reveals its value. The diseases taught humanity about the interconnectedness of all things. Cholera revealed that what happened in one part of a city affected all parts. A cesspit in a poor neighborhood could poison the water supply of the rich. Disease did not respect social boundaries, could not be walled away or ignored. This understanding forced changes in how cities were organized and governed. Public health became, slowly and grudgingly, a public responsibility. The idea that authorities had an obligation to provide clean water and proper sanitation, that preventing disease was a governmental duty rather than individual responsibility, this was revolutionary. It met fierce resistance. People did not want to pay taxes for sewers in neighborhoods they would never visit, for water systems that served the poor. But disease made the argument impossible to ignore. Either everyone had clean water, or no one was truly safe. Either all neighborhoods had sanitation, or disease would cycle endlessly through the city. The medieval plagues also revealed the limitations of religious explanations for natural phenomena. When prayers failed to stop the plague, when the devout died as readily as the sinful, when the church's remedies proved no more effective than folk superstitions, people began to question. Not openly, not at first, but doubt crept in. If God caused the plague as punishment, why did babies die? If penance could lift the curse, why did the flagellants spread disease faster than anyone else? If the church held the keys to salvation, why were priests dying in such numbers? These questions did not lead immediately to the Reformation or the Enlightenment, but they planted seeds. They opened tiny cracks in the edifice of unquestioned religious authority. Through those cracks, over centuries, would grow the shoots of scientific inquiry, of skepticism, of the idea that natural events might have natural causes that could be discovered and understood. I watched this transformation slowly, so slowly it was barely visible, except to someone like me, who had the luxury of centuries to observe. A village priest in 1400 spoke with absolute certainty about God's will. His great-great-grandson, wearing the same vestments and serving the same parish, spoke with just a hint of uncertainty, a tiny acknowledgement that some things might be beyond his understanding. By 1600, that acknowledgement had grown. By 1800, the world had changed entirely. The suffering of the plague years, the famine years, the cholera years, all that terrible pain, it was not meaningless. It taught humanity how to fight back. It forced the development of public health, of scientific medicine, of the infrastructure that makes modern life possible. But the price was so high, so very high, millions upon millions of lives, each one a universe of experience and potential, snuffed out by diseases that might have been prevented with knowledge that would come too late to save them. I have lived long enough to see diseases that once terrified the world reduced to footnotes in medical textbooks. Smallpox, that ancient scourge, was eradicated entirely in 1979. The last natural case occurred, and then there were no more. A disease that had killed hundreds of millions across human history simply ceased to exist in the wild. Plague still exists, but it is treatable now. Antibiotics turn a death sentence into a minor inconvenience. Cholera, that great killer of the 19th century, is easily prevented and easily cured. The diseases that shaped history have been, if not conquered, at least contained. and yet new diseases appear. I have watched them emerge, one after another, each one a reminder that the war is never truly won, only the battles. The victory over smallpox was real and important, but it did not end the story. The story continues, will always continue, as long as humans and microbes share this world. What gives me hope, and I do have hope, despite all I have witnessed, is that humanity's response to disease has improved. When a new epidemic emerges now, we do not blame divine wrath or poison air. We sequence its genome, develop vaccines, implement public health measures based on evidence rather than superstition. The knowledge bought with so much suffering has not been lost. It has been built upon, expanded, refined. Each generation stands on the shoulders of all who came before, all who learned through pain how to fight back against disease. The medieval peasant who ate bark bread and survived the famine, the plague victim who recovered against all odds, the cholera patient who lived because someone had the insight to provide clean water. All of them contributed to the accumulated knowledge that protects billions today. They did not die for nothing. Their suffering was not meaningless. They were the price of progress, the cost of learning, the sacrifice that bought a better world for those who came after. It is a harsh accounting. I wish it could have been otherwise. I wish knowledge could have come without such terrible cost. But this is the world we have. This is how humans learn, slowly, painfully, at great cost, but learning nonetheless. As one who has watched the cycles turn for centuries uncounted, I have learned to see the patterns that repeat through history. Diseases change, technologies advance, but human nature remains remarkably constant, and with it, the patterns of how societies respond to crisis. Every epidemic follows a similar arc. First comes denial. The disease is somewhere else, happening to other people. It cannot reach here. It will not affect us. This denial is dangerous, but perhaps necessary. If people truly understood the scale of what was coming, the panic might be worse than the disease itself. Then comes the arrival. The first cases appear. The denial crumbles. Panic rises to replace it. People seek explanations, need someone or something to blame. In medieval times, they blamed God's wrath, or poisoned wells, or malign stars. In later times, they blamed immigrants, or foreign nations, or modern decadence. The specific target changes, but the impulse remains the same. Suffering must have a cause, and that cause must be someone's fault. Next comes the phase of frantic activity. Remedies are tried, most of them useless or actively harmful. In the medieval period, it was bloodletting and flagellation and burning aromatic woods. In the cholera years, it was fumigation and opium and chalk mixed with water. Every age has its arsenal of treatments that do not work, and every age insists on trying them anyway because action, even futile action, feels better than helplessness. Gradually, if the society survives long enough, a few measures begin to show promise. Isolation helps. Sanitation helps. Whatever the specific, effective intervention might be, it is usually simple and obvious in hindsight. But discovering it requires observation, logic, and the willingness to discard theories that do not match reality, qualities that are surprisingly rare when fear grips a population. As the disease begins to recede, whether through effective measures or simply by running out of susceptible hosts, comes the period of reflection and reform. Hospitals are built. Laws are passed. Infrastructure is improved. The survivors swear they will not be caught unprepared again. Then comes the final phase, forgetting. The crisis fades from living memory. The measures taken during the emergency seem excessive in retrospect. The infrastructure built to prevent the next outbreak is allowed to decay. The lessons learned are filed away and gradually forgotten until the next crisis comes and the cycle begins again. I have watched this pattern repeat with plague and cholera and influenza and diseases whose names have been lost to time. The specifics change, but the pattern endures, as reliable as the seasons. The Great Influenza of 1918 through 1919 followed this pattern with terrible precision. I watched it sweep across a world still reeling from the Great War, killing more people in 2 years than the war had killed in 4. It began, as so many diseases do, quietly, a few cases in military camps in the spring of 1918. Nothing alarming. People had been sick before. People would be sick again. The war dominated everyone's attention. A little flu was hardly worth noticing. By autumn, it had become impossible to ignore. The disease had mutated into something far more lethal. Young, healthy adults. Precisely the population usually most resistant to influenza were dying in their thousands. The disease killed not through slow wasting, but through a kind of immune system overreaction. The body's defenses turning against itself with savage efficiency. I walked through Philadelphia in October of 1918. The city had held a massive Liberty Loan Parade to support the war effort, gathering tens of thousands of people in tight crowds. Within days, the hospitals were overwhelmed. Within a week, people were dying faster than they could be buried. The city, one of America's largest and most prosperous, ground to a halt. Bodies lay in homes for days because there were no coffins, no gravediggers, no one able to provide funerals. People wore masks of gauze, believing they offered protection. Some cities banned public gatherings, others did not, and paid for it with higher death tolls. The patterns of medieval plague repeated in a modern city, proving that technology alone does not protect against pandemic. The disease moved faster than anything before it. Steamships and railroads, the marvels of the age, became highways for contagion. A person could board a train healthy and disembark dying. The disease crossed oceans in days rather than months. It reached remote Pacific islands and Arctic communities that had never experienced influenza before. The death toll in these virgin soil populations was catastrophic. I stood on a Samoan beach in December of 1918 and watched a village prepare mass graves. 20% of the population had died in a matter of weeks. The survivors, shocked and disoriented, went through the motions of burial with hollow eyes. They had no explanation for what had happened, no framework to understand it. The disease had simply appeared, killed, and now was fading. Like a storm or an earthquake, it was a force of nature beyond comprehension or control. By the time the pandemic finally burned itself out in late 1919, it had killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, more than the Black Death in absolute numbers, though a smaller percentage of the global population. It remains the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. And yet, how many people today know of it? How often is it discussed or remembered? The Great War, which killed fewer people, dominates historical memory. The influenza pandemic, which killed more, is barely mentioned. It has been called the forgotten pandemic, and the name is apt. Why is it forgotten? Perhaps because it lacked a clear villain. Wars have enemies, sides to root for, heroes and villains. Pandemics are more ambiguous. Everyone is a victim. There is no one to blame, no one to rally against. And so the memory fades, subsumed by events that make for better stories. Or perhaps it is forgotten because people want to forget. The pandemic was a reminder of human vulnerability, of how little control we truly have, of how quickly modern civilization can be brought to its knees by something invisible. These are uncomfortable truths. It is easier to focus on wars, which at least create the illusion that human will and courage can shape outcomes. I have seen this forgetting happen again and again. The lessons are learned, then discarded. The preparations are made, then allowed to decay. The warnings are issued, then ignored, until the next time, when everyone acts surprised that such a thing could happen again. After the 1918 influenza, many countries established or strengthened their public health infrastructure. They recognized the need for disease surveillance, for rapid response systems, for international cooperation. These systems worked, more or less, for several decades. Then, slowly, they were neglected. Funding was cut. Staff was reduced. The institutional memory faded. By the time new pandemics emerged, HIV in the 1980s, SARS in 2003, countless others, the systems meant to detect and respond to them were shadows of what they had been. This pattern frustrates me more than I can express. I have lived long enough to see humanity make the same mistakes again and again, to watch each generation ignore the hard-won wisdom of those who came before. It is as if the species is cursed to relearn every lesson at full cost, unable or unwilling to learn from history. And yet there is also progress, real, measurable progress. When the next influenza pandemic comes, and it will come, as surely as winter follows autumn, humanity will not respond as it did in 1918 or in 1448. We have vaccines now, antivirals, intensive care units, ventilators. We understand how viruses spread and mutate. We can sequence a new pathogen's genome in days rather than years or never. The progress is real, but so is the forgetting, the neglect, the complacency that always follows crisis once the crisis has passed. And this tension between the knowledge we have gained and our tendency to ignore it, this will shape how we face the next pandemic and all those that follow. I have learned in my long years not to expect perfection from humanity. We are flawed creatures, prone to forgetting, to selfishness, to choosing comfort over wisdom. But we are also capable of remarkable things when pressed. We can learn, we can adapt, we can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. The question is never whether we can rise to a challenge. History proves we can. The question is whether we will prepare before the challenge arrives, or whether we will wait until crisis forces action, paying once again the terrible price of unpreparedness. I fear I know the answer, but I keep hoping to be proven wrong. As my tale draws toward its close, I find myself reflecting not on the diseases themselves, not on the death tolls or the suffering, but on something more fundamental, the simple fact that life continued, that through all the darkness, all the horror, all the loss, humanity persisted. This might seem obvious. After all, we are still here, you and I, having this conversation across the centuries. But when you stand in the midst of apocalypse, when half your neighbors are dead and the other half are dying, when the future seems not just uncertain, but impossible, in those moments, continuation is not obvious at all. It is a choice, made again and again, day after day, by people who had every reason to give up. I remember a woman in England during the Black Death. Her name was Marjorie, and she lost everything. Her husband died in the first week. Her 3 children followed within days. Her parents, her siblings, the man she had hoped her daughter might marry, all gone. Within a month, she was alone. I watched her sit in her empty cottage on a cold November evening, the fire nearly out, no sound but the wind through the thatch. She had every reason to simply lie down and wait for death. Many did. The grief, the loneliness, the sheer weight of loss, it was too much. They gave up, and death came for them soon enough. But Marjorie did not lie down. She stood up. She rebuilt the fire. She fed the chickens that had somehow survived. She went to the well for water. She lived not because she had hope. I do not think she did. Not then. Not because she saw a future worth living for, but because living was what one did. You woke up, you tended the fire, you fed the animals, you carried water. These simple acts, repeated daily, were how you continued. And continuation, however empty it might feel in the moment, was itself a form of victory. I have seen this pattern countless times. In the aftermath of every disaster, there are always people like Marjorie. They do not give inspiring speeches or lead rebellions or perform heroic deeds. They simply persist. They maintain the routines that keep life moving forward. They are the quiet heroes, the ones history rarely remembers, but without whom there would be no history at all. The famine survivors who planted fields, even when they had eaten the seed grain and had nothing left but faith that somehow, somewhere, they would find seeds for the next planting. The plague widows who opened their homes to orphaned children, expanding their own sorrow to encompass others' losses. The cholera survivors who cleaned the streets and wells of their neighborhoods, working to prevent the disease from returning. These were not exceptional people. They were ordinary men and women doing what needed to be done because someone had to do it. Their ordinariness was, perhaps, their greatest strength. They proved that you did not need to be special to persevere, that courage was not a rare gift, but a common choice, available to anyone willing to make it. I think of a village in France that was completely depopulated by plague in 1349. Every resident either died or fled. For years, it stood empty, houses crumbling, fields reverting to wilderness, silence where once there had been life. Then, in 1354, a family arrived. They were refugees from another region, fleeing some local conflict I have long since forgotten. They found this abandoned village and decided to stay. They moved into one of the less damaged houses. They cleared a field. They planted crops. Other refugees found them. Within a year, a dozen families had resettled the village. Within 5 years, it was thriving again. New children played in streets where plague victims had once died. New songs were sung in the church where prayers for the dead had once echoed. Life had returned, not because the past was forgotten. The villagers knew the history of the place they had claimed, but because life goes on regardless. This is perhaps the most important lesson I have learned in all my long years, that life is more stubborn than death. Death is powerful, yes. It claims us all eventually, but life is persistent, creative, endlessly renewable. For every person death takes, 2 more are born. For every field that lies fallow, another is planted. For every song that ends, a new one begins. The medieval peasants understood this in their bones, even if they could not articulate it. They did not have the luxury of existential despair. They could not afford to spend days pondering the meaning of their suffering. There were crops to plant, animals to tend, children to feed. The immediate demands of survival left little room for philosophical crisis. This might seem like a limitation, and in some ways it was, but it was also a gift. When your days are filled with necessary tasks, you do not have time to spiral into darkness. The routine itself carries you forward, one day at a time, until you look back and realize you have survived not just the crisis, but its aftermath, and you are still here, still breathing, still capable of joy, however briefly it visits. I remember the first feast day after the Great Famine ended. The harvest of 1322 was not abundant. The land was still recovering, but it was. And thus ends another memory from ages long past. If you have found a spark of wonder here, stay a while longer, for there are countless tales yet to be remembered.